Hello everyone, my name is Eric Hernandez and this is my presentation for Ruben Garote's course on utopias. My presentation, titled Utopia to Dystopia, will cover what comes from trying to implement a utopia into real life and how the views of the utopia can shift upon implementation. Particularly, I will be covering the implementation of the communist utopia and how communism is now tied to dystopian thinking and sentiments. Let's get going with it. Before we begin with the presentation, I want to give a breakdown of the topics that I'm going to cover in order to make my point. As you see, the agenda includes the title page and the agenda. It's just to make sense of the page number that's on the top right corner. But the topics that I will cover are Thomas More's Utopia of the 16th century, the Communist Manifesto, Lenin's implementation of communism in Russia and how it differed from the views of Marx and Engels, and ultimately Orwell's 1984 and how it portrayed the implementation of communism in a society as a totalitarian state. Before covering the writing of Marx and Engels and the implementation of that writing, we first have to cover the first instance in which a utopia was presented as something that was attainable in the present day. Thomas More wrote Utopia as a response to large disparity between rich and poor in his society, labeled aristocrats and peasants respectively. He also noted that the main issue that promoted inequality and theft in society was private property, and the eradication of the institution would remove these wrongs in society. His writing was based on an island in the New World, one that did not develop private property. It was noted that everyone was deemed an equal in society and labeled a label that allowed the society to act in a more communal way. They also stopped caring about hoarding property and used items based on need rather than want. The idea was that greed and selfishness were eradicated from society. This was a precursor to some of the thinking that Engels and Marx would provide in their manifesto, as they both shared the ending of private property. Where they differ was the maintaining of the hierarchy in society, in which families and government were kept on the island of Utopia, where Marx and Engels believed in abolishing the nuclear family and the eventual removal of the government once a full communist society was achieved. Similarly, the use of slavery in Utopia would counter the ideas of the Communist Manifesto, since having the label of slave meant that someone would not be an equal to their peers. Having covered Utopia, now let's dive into the Communist Manifesto. The idea behind the Communist Manifesto, published in London by Engels and Marx in 1848, focused on the final stage of society, in which the worker was to control the means of production. The manifesto was to act like a prescription for society, since it was seen as a final stage for society, one that started agrarian and later developed into capitalism that came with the larger industrial revolution. It was believed that the owners of factories, or bourgeoisie, were exploiting the workers, proletariats, for their profit, and it was time for the worker to take matters into their own hands. They believed that all of society was built to support the structures of exploitation, and it was up to the worker to dismantle the whole status quo for a utopia that would give everyone equal ownership of the means of production. In this utopia, there would not be a need for any government or money, as the people would be able to provide for themselves without the need of a governing body watching what they're doing. The people would consume products on a need basis, eradicating the human trait of greed and selfishness. If nothing had a monetary value and was so abundant that demand was on the floor, there was no need to hoard products made by the worker. In this manner, society would get rid of all inequality in society, bringing the idea of a utopia to the real world. The only means of bringing about a communist utopia was by revolution, where the proletariat would bring violence until all of the status quo was abolished. The application of the communist utopian idea first came in Russia, a nation that was deeply rooted in agrarianism and living on its feudal shadows. In 1917, Vladimir Lenin led a revolution that tumbled the Tsardom that had ran Russia for 300 years. The view of communism by Lenin, though following the same theoretical ideals as Marx and Engels, was different in the manner of application. Lenin argued that the people of Russia were not enlightened to the wonders of the communist utopia and required an agent to bring the enlightenment to them. Once the populace realized the wonders of the utopia, the government would fade out of existence, reaching the same end goals as that of Marx and Engels. This form of thinking brought about the establishment of vanguard parties in countries trying to establish communist utopias across the world. These parties would collect all of the private property of the populace and, in theory, divide it equally amongst the people. As time progressed, they were to indoctrinate the people into their ideology until it reached a point in which everyone was a communist. In reality, these parties just kept themselves in power until the government was either removed by the people or they themselves resigned. In that time, the government promoted authoritarian rule by the means of censorship, extreme and cruel punishment, including killings, disappearances, and torture to anyone who dissented, abolishment of all private ownership or rights, and the removal of all political organizations besides those of the Communist Party. In this manner, the government replaced the business owners that Marx and Engels wrote of and placed themselves in the place of the oppressor. The party, all the while, maintained that they were trying to reach the communist utopia. As the horror stories of these communist nations began spreading throughout the world, the ideals of the communist promise was beginning to dwindle out of utopias and being seen as a dystopia. The belief was that the people were not to be trusted with bringing communism to the world, as those bringing communism would be corrupt themselves. One of the examples of this was Oceania, the country that controlled all of the Americas and the land holdings of the British Empire in George Orwell's 1984. In this country, a party promoting English socialism succeeded in bringing about a communist revolution against the American government, who was set to control all these holdings. The result of this revolution over 30 years later was a mass-surveilled totalitarian state that did not grant the people the individual freedom to even think. A new language was designated and forced upon the people, known as Newspeak, with the goal of removing any possible moment of dissentful thinking by a single person. Those who were found to be thinking in a manner that opposed the government were tortured to the point that they did not even recall their past selves. All forms of individualism were removed, including the person's right to choose a partner out of love, as relationships were only kept because of the need of a populace to reproduce and keep making workers. The party fully became what Marx set out to destroy, a class above the rest. The dystopia that was Oceania and Insoc was a warning from Orwell as to the horrors that can come from trying to implement communism in a society the same way that it was implemented in Russia, Eastern Europe, and will later be in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. As we have seen, the thinking of a utopian society that could have been seen in real life did not progress well into reality. Although the formula was not followed in the exact manner that was prescribed by Engels and Marx, the end goal of all formulas was to reach the communist utopia. The formula was failed in multiple different attempts across the globe, all of which ended in the establishment of authoritarian governments replacing the position of business owners Marx warned of. The thinking of the ideology shifted from that of a positive utopia to a dystopia, warning people of the outcomes that was to be abolishing private property and money from society. We see it today, where people still scream to abolish private property and to tax the rich to the point where they're equal to those that are poor. And seeing the rise of technology and the rise of mass surveillance that is going on in a democratic system, we do have to question whether or not we will see another society like that of Oceania. I would like to leave you with this. Although we do not know what the future holds, we can conclude that at least to some extent, the ideals of Marx and Engels in promoting a communist utopia were tamed. Thank you.